There is a specific agonizing silence that immediately precedes the total extinction of a species. Envoy Marcus Vance was currently standing right in the middle of it. He adjusted the lapels of his charcoal suit, acutely aware that he was the only primate in a room designed by and for beings who considered themselves gods. The Great Hall of the Valerix Empire was not just a throne room. It was an architectural weapon meant to shatter the psychology of anyone invited inside. The walls were forged from polished dark matter, reflecting a distorted, abyssal version of reality. The ceiling was an atmospheric dome that did not merely show the stars, but simulated a churning, conquered nebula in agonizingly slow motion. Rivers of liquid light, cold and sterile, cut through the floor like glowing veins. It was a space built to remind outsiders that they were nothing more than temporary cosmic dust. At the far end of this cavernous space sat Emperor Xylar on the apex throne. The Emperor was a terrifying specimen of bioengineered perfection. He stood 11 feet tall when fully upright, though currently he was lounging with aggressive nonchalance. His physique was wrapped in shimmering, chromatic scales that shifted color depending on his mood, presently glowing a vibrant, contemptuous violet. He possessed 6 eyes, all of them currently locked onto Marcus, and all of them projecting the exact same emotion. It was a smirk. It was a completely universal expression that required no translation software. It was the absolute, unadulterated arrogance of a landlord who was about to casually step on an ant because the ant had the audacity to exist on his driveway. Marcus stood his ground at the center of the hall, a tiny speck of mammalian defiance surrounded by hundreds of towering Valerix elite guards. These guards held stasis lances capable of turning a human being into a floating cloud of separated atoms. Yet Marcus kept his hands loosely clasped behind his back. The political stakes of this meeting were incredibly straightforward, which only made them more terrifying. Earth was cornered. 30 days ago, the Valerix Armada dropped out of faster-than-light travel and effectively blotted out the sun. 1,000 dreadnoughts, each the size of a small moon, now formed a suffocating steel ring around humanity's home world. There was no declaration of war. There was no grand battle. The Valerix simply arrived, scanned the planet, laughed at Earth's primitive nuclear arsenal, and demanded the keys to the atmosphere. Marcus Vance had been sent across the galaxy not to negotiate, but to deliver humanity's unconditional surrender. Or at least, that is what the Emperor believed. Envoy of dirt, Emperor Xylar's voice boomed, a rich, synthesized baritone that rattled the molars in Marcus's skull. You have traveled a very long way just to bow. Tell me, do your knees tremble? Or is your species simply that eager to embrace its new servitude? Marcus offered a tight, polite smile. My knees are fine. Your radiance, though I will admit, the artificial gravity in the hallway was a bit aggressive. I think I pulled a hamstring on the way in. A ripple of low, dangerous murmurs echoed through the courtiers lining the walls. The violet scales on Xylar's neck darkened slightly, a sign of irritation disrupting his amusement. He leaned forward, resting a massive, clawed hand under his chin. You bring humor to a slaughter, Xylar mused, his smirk widening again, revealing a row of needle-sharp, crystalline teeth. Fascinating. We have cataloged your species. Marcus Vance, we know you are remarkably fragile. Your bodies break under minor pressure. Your lifespans are tragically brief. You rely on kinetic weapons that hurl bits of metal at each other. You are an evolutionary joke that somehow managed to build a rudimentary hyperdrive. And now, the joke has reached its punchline. We are definitely squishy, Marcus agreed pleasantly, pulling a small, antique silver pocket watch from his vest. And we do love throwing metal at things, but we are also incredibly stubborn, and occasionally we find things in the dark that even you haven't seen. Marcus flipped the watch open. It was not ticking seconds. The face had been heavily modified with Earth's most classified quantum decay tracking technology. Numbers spun wildly on a digital readout grafted onto the silver face. He was waiting for a very specific alignment. Xylar barked a harsh, booming laugh. "Do not attempt to posture human. Your world is currently staring down the barrels of my fleet. You have nothing to offer but your labor, and you have nothing to leverage but your continued breathing. Present the treaty of capitulation, or I will give the order to turn your blue oceans to steam." "About that treaty," Marcus said, keeping his eyes on the spinning numbers. "We had to make a few last-minute revisions. My team is bringing the updated document now. They are running a bit behind. Traffic in the royal corridor was a nightmare." The Emperor's smirk hardened into a scowl. "No one enters the Great Hall without my express invitation." Right as Xylar spoke the words, the heavy doors at the far end of the hall let out a deep, resonant groan. The sound echoed violently against the dark matter walls. The Valerix guards instantly raised their stasis lances, the tips glowing with a lethal, blinding blue energy. Xylar did not order them to fire. His curiosity momentarily overrode his lethal instincts. He wanted to see what pathetic display the human had orchestrated. Through the towering doorway marched 6 human marines. They looked entirely out of place in this pristine, opulent palace. They were clad in heavy, scarred tactical armor, their boots thudding heavily against the delicate, glowing floor. They were sweating, their faces set in grim, terrified determination. But they were not carrying weapons. They were hauling heavy chains attached to a massive, hovering containment cage. The cage was a brutal piece of engineering. It was not elegant. It was a jagged, utilitarian box forged from dense, depleted uranium and wrapped in thick, glowing cables pulsing with a sickly yellow energy. It hummed with a violent vibration, struggling against the anti-gravity repulsors that kept it afloat. The Marines dug their heels in, straining to pull the platform forward down the center aisle of the hall, directly toward the Emperor. Xylar watched them struggle, his amusement returning. "A tribute?" the Emperor asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You bring a caged beast to my throne. Do you think a rare creature from your doomed mudball will buy you leniency? Or perhaps it is a weapon, a desperate, primitive bomb you hope to detonate?" "It is not a bomb," Marcus said quietly. He snapped his silver pocket watch shut and slipped it back into his vest. He finally looked up, his eyes locking directly onto Xylar's. "And it is definitely not a tribute." The Marines brought the platform to a grinding halt exactly 50 paces from the apex throne. They immediately fell back, locking their boots to the floor and gripping the heavy chains as if their lives depended on it. "Open the blast shields," Marcus ordered. One of the Marines slammed a fist onto a heavy control panel on the side of the platform. The thick uranium plating on the front of the cage slid upward with a heavy, grinding metallic protest. The Valerix elite guards braced themselves, expecting a monster to lunge outward. The courtiers leaned in, expecting an exotic animal. Emperor Xylar maintained his arrogant slouch, waiting to be unimpressed. The moment the shield locked into the open position, the atmosphere in the Great Hall changed. It did not just drop in temperature. The very fabric of gravity in the room seemed to invert. The rivers of liquid light on the floor flickered and dimmed. The simulated nebula on the ceiling warped, spinning wildly out of control. Inside the cage was not an animal. It was a swirling, agonizingly beautiful mass of multi-dimensional geometry. It was a storm of searing, pure white light that defied the visual spectrum, folding in on itself in endless, impossible patterns. It radiated an aura of immense ancient power that bypassed the physical senses and struck directly at the mind. And it was bound, brutal, Heavy gravity tethers of crude human design pierced the entity's radiant form, pulsing with a disruptive frequency that kept the being pinned, shrinking its infinite nature into a confined, agonizing space. It was a collar of pure science choked around the neck of something divine. Emperor Xylar stopped breathing. The vibrant, contemptuous violet scales covering his body instantly drained of all color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. His 6 eyes widened to the point of tearing. The massive, clawed hand resting under his chin slipped, and he slumped forward, gripping the arms of his throne with trembling desperation. The smirk vanished completely. It was replaced by a slack-jawed, hollow expression of absolute, cosmological horror. He stared at the cage, his mind violently rejecting the reality of what his eyes were seeing. Marcus Vance took a slow, deliberate step forward, the sound of his leather shoe deafening in the suddenly silent hall. He looked at the trembling emperor, then gestured casually toward the swirling, chained entity in the cage. "Your radiance," Marcus said, his voice crystal clear in the deadened room. "Allow me to introduce the new terms of our agreement. The universe has a deeply ironic way of shifting power. One moment you are the undisputed master of 1 billion star systems, and the next, you are staring at your supreme deity strapped to a modified cargo pallet." The entity writhing inside the containment cage was not something the human mind, or even the highly advanced Valeric's mind, was meant to process directly. It was a fractal storm of pure, unadulterated quantum energy. It had no face, no limbs, and no fixed geometry. Instead, it was an ever-shifting cascade of searing white brilliance that folded in and out of 3-dimensional space, resembling a star caught in an endless, agonizing cycle of going supernova and collapsing back into a dwarf. It smelled of ozone and burnt sugar, a sharp, metallic scent that coated the back of the throat. It did not make a noise so much as it projected a violent, aching vibration directly into the marrow of everyone present. To the Valerics, this was the luminary. It was the architect of their cosmos, the divine light that guided their armada, the sacred spark from which their emperor claimed his absolute right to rule. It was the centerpiece of their religion, a being of infinite majesty and wrath. And right now, it was wearing a straitjacket made of human spite. The tethers holding the entity were incredibly ugly. They were thick, brutalist iron-gray bands of localized gravity, engineered with a complete disregard for aesthetics. They wrapped around the shifting storm of light, pinching the entity's infinite geometry into a compressed, agonizingly tight sphere. Every time the luminary surged, trying to expand and consume the room, the tethers sparked with a harsh brute force electrical surge, slapping the divine energy back into its assigned volume. It looked profoundly wrong. It was like watching someone try to trap a hurricane inside a rusty trash can. The silence in the Great Hall was total, absolute, and suffocating. The transition from sneering arrogance to primal existential panic happened in a fraction of a second. A highly decorated Valeric's courtier in the front row dropped his ornate ceremonial staff. The clatter of the metal against the dark matter floor sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. 2 advisors near the throne simply collapsed, their knees giving out as their brains fundamentally failed to reconcile their absolute faith with the visual evidence presented before them. Emperor Xylar remained frozen. The vibrant, contemptuous violet scales that had armored his body only moments ago were now a sickly, ashen gray. His massive hands gripped the armrests of the apex throne so tightly that the polished material began to crack and splinter under his claws. His 6 eyes were wide, unblinking, and entirely devoid of their former superiority. The theological implications were tearing his reality apart in real time. If the supreme creator of the universe could be chained like a rabid dog, then what exactly was an emperor? Marcus Vance broke the silence. He casually brushed a speck of dust off the sleeve of his charcoal suit and began to pace slowly in front of the violently humming cage. "I know the presentation is a little rough," Marcus said, his voice echoing clearly across the vast, terrified hall. "The cage was a rush job. We had to scavenge parts from a decommissioned particle accelerator in Geneva. But she holds—" Xylar opened his mouth to speak. He tried to summon the booming synthesized baritone that commanded star fleets, but all that emerged was a hollow, breathless rasp. "The luminary. You have touched the divine. We call it a Class 5 quantum anomaly," Marcus corrected smoothly, stopping to lean slightly toward the Emperor. "And capturing it wasn't easy. Your radiance. You see, when your dreadnoughts parked in our orbit and started counting down the days until our scheduled extinction, our brightest minds decided to get a little creative, a little desperate." Marcus gestured toward the brutalist gravity tethers choking the entity. "You cannot shoot a god. You cannot stab a concept. But Dr. Elena Rostova, a woman who drank entirely too much synthetic espresso and slept under her desk, theorized that if a being is composed of pure probability, you simply have to force it to observe itself. You cage its physics." He paused, letting the weight of human audacity sink into the alien minds around him. He did not boast. He simply stated the grim, terrifying facts of human survival. "We put 300 of our best scientists in a subterranean bunker." Marcus continued, his tone darkening slightly. "We rerouted the remaining power grid of the entire European continent to a single, unshielded laboratory. The first calibration test vaporized the entire lower sublevel. Gone. Just ash and shadows burned into the concrete. The second test permanently blinded half the engineering team. But they kept calculating. They kept building. Because when the alternative is total species annihilation, humans are willing to endure a truly spectacular amount of collateral damage." Marcus pointed a finger at the pulsing, ugly metal bands holding the storm of light. In those tethers are collapsed micro-singularities, strung together with supercooled superconducting wire. It does not cage the entity's body. It cages its reality. Doctor, Rostova sacrificed her own life to manually lock the final sequence, pulling the lever while her physical form was torn apart by localized radiation. She did not do it for glory. She did it so I could stand in this room and have this conversation with you. Emperor Xylar slowly rose from his ruined throne. His massive frame was trembling, a violent tremor that started in his legs and shook his entire body. The elite guards lining the walls were entirely useless. Their stasis lances wavered, pointing vaguely at the floor. They were trained to fight rebels, monsters, and rival empires. They were not trained to shoot at the cage currently holding their god, terrified that a stray blast might rupture the universe. "And this is blasphemy," Xylar whispered, the words sounding fragile, as if the concept itself was breaking apart. "It is an illusion, a trick of primitive light." "It is very real," Marcus countered, tapping the side of the dense uranium cage. The metal groaned in response. "And the containment grid is currently eating a gigawatt a minute. Don't mind the sparks. We brought spare batteries. But honestly, even our surviving engineers are not entirely sure what happens if the dampeners hit zero. Will it vaporize this palace? Will it fold this entire star system into a pocket dimension? The math is a bit fuzzy." Marcus watched the Emperor flinch at the erratic whine of the cage's machinery. He had them. The psychological warfare was complete. But this was only the first phase. Capturing the entity was one miracle. Discovering where it had been hiding was entirely another. Finding a god required sailing into the one place on the star maps that even the Valerix Armada refused to navigate. Of course, building the leash was only half the battle, Marcus added, a slight knowing smile returning to his face. Finding the beast to put in it required a little road trip. We noticed a massive blind spot in your patrol routes, a sector of space your empire meticulously avoids. I believe your navigational charts refer to it as the dead sector. The mention of the dead sector caused a secondary wave of visible panic to ripple through the Valeric's advisors. Xylar stepped back, his back hitting the remnants of his throne. Marcus clasped his hands behind his back once more, looking entirely at home in the center of the hostile alien palace. So, your radiance. Now that the pleasantries are out of the way, let us talk about the terms of Earth's new treaty. Because I assure you, humanity is done bowing. There is a jagged ink-black stain on every Valeric star chart where your military cartographers simply stopped drawing and started praying. They call it the dead sector, a region of deep space so fundamentally shattered that even ambient light refuses to travel through it in a straight line. Marcus stopped pacing and let the name hang in the frigid air of the Great Hall. The mere mention of the sector caused a visible flinch among the towering, heavily armored elite guards. It was a taboo zone, an abyss ruled by cosmic anomalies and strictly forbidden by imperial decree. But human beings have always viewed forbidden as a dare rather than a warning. Back on Earth, as the Valeric's armada choked the sky, the global leadership collapsed into a pathetic display of panic. Politicians and billionaires squabbled violently over the few remaining subterranean arcs, negotiating who would get to survive the orbital bombardment while the rest of the planet burned. The official channels of government were completely useless. But humanity has always relied on the stubborn and the insubordinate when the world is ending. A rogue coalition of black site generals, disgraced astrophysicists, and unhinged test pilots gathered in a classified bunker deep beneath the Andes Mountains. They realized that negotiating with a fleet of alien dreadnoughts was impossible. They needed leverage. They needed a miracle. So, they decided to steal one. They hijacked Earth's last functional, highly unstable slipspace cruiser. They did not wait for legislative approval. They loaded the raw, untested gravity tethers into the cargo bay, fueled the drives with experimental antimatter, and initiated a blind jump directly into the heart of the dead sector. It was an expedition funded by treason and fueled by absolute, terrifying desperation. Entering the anomaly was not a matter of simply flying through turbulence. The dead sector was a graveyard of broken physics. Marcus described the journey to the silent, captive audience of alien aristocrats. He painted a picture of a human crew navigating a nightmare where reality itself was melting. Within the first hour of crossing the threshold, the ship's advanced navigation computers completely liquefied, unable to process the sheer volume of mathematical impossibilities crashing against the hull. Time lost its linear grip. A junior communications officer aged 40 years in a single afternoon, his hair turning snow-white as he sat frozen at his console. Meanwhile, the ship's captain remained stuck repeating the same 3 seconds of a Tuesday morning for an entire week. Gravity shifted arbitrarily, turning the ceilings into floors and causing bulkheads to bleed a highly corrosive, hyper-dense fluid that smelled like rusted iron. It was a chaotic soup of cosmic errors designed to crush any rational mind. But humans are uniquely equipped to handle absolute chaos because we are born into it. We thrive in the irrational. When the digital systems failed, a stubborn mechanic from the lower decks bypassed the mainframes entirely. She wired an analog gyroscope directly into the manual thruster controls, and steered a multi-billion-dollar starship through a 5-dimensional asteroid field, using a rigged joystick and raw, unadulterated instinct. The Valerics rely on absolute order and predictable calculations. Humans rely on duct tape, adrenaline, and an absurd refusal to die. Deep inside that churning, hostile abyss, The human expedition found the prize. It was not a hidden weapon or a lost super-civilization. It was a localized nexus of creation, adrift in a vacuum of frozen time. The luminary. Marcus turned his gaze back to the containment cage resting heavily on the dark matter floor. The entity inside writhed, throwing a blinding, silent tantrum against its iron-gray bindings. The human crew had looked out the viewport of their battered, sparking ship and beheld a creature of absolute majesty. They saw a sentient intellect older than the stars themselves, radiating an aura that brought hardened veterans to their knees in spontaneous weeping. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. And the very first thing humanity did was strap a bomb to it and drag it into a cage. A heavy, uncomfortable shadow crossed Marcus's face. The humor and the bravado faded, replaced by a profound, agonizing guilt that he rarely let surface. This was the moral rot at the core of humanity's great triumph. They were standing up to the oppressive, tyrannical Valerix Empire. They were fighting for the fundamental right to exist free from subjugation. Yet, to secure that freedom, they had traveled to the edge of the universe to enslave a sentient cosmic being. Marcus looked directly at Emperor Xylar. The towering alien ruler was still gripping the remnants of his throne, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Do you know what it costs a species to do something like this?" Marcus asked, his voice dropping to a low, intense register. "To look at something divine and slap chains on it? We became the very monsters we are trying to fight. We justified the ultimate cosmic sin because the alternative was watching our children turn to ash. We traded our collective soul for a loaded gun." The hypocrisy of it burned Marcus daily. He was the envoy of a desperate people, but he was also the warden of an innocent prisoner. The human government back on Earth saw the luminary merely as a battery and a bargaining chip. They did not care about the agonizing frequency of the gravity tethers crushing the entity's consciousness. They only cared that the Valerix Armada would hesitate to fire if their god was held hostage. But Marcus knew something that the politicians on Earth did not. And he knew something that the terrified Valerix Emperor did not. During the exact moment the gravity tethers had snapped shut in the dead sector, right before the entity was violently compressed into its agonizing spherical prison. It had transmitted a single, highly compressed burst of data directly into the ship's analog communication array. It was a massive information packet disguised as a burst of ambient radiation. The scientists back on Earth dismissed it as an electromagnetic death rattle. But Marcus had spent weeks alone in the cargo hold with the caged entity during the long voyage to the Valerix capital. He had listened to the playback of that signal. It did not sound like the wrathful roar of an almighty creator. It sounded remarkably like a distress call. It sounded like a prisoner thanking its new captors for finally breaking the seal on a cage that had held it in the dead sector for 1,000,000 years. Who, or what, had originally locked the luminary in that broken region of space? Marcus shifted his weight, his eyes scanning the massive throne room. While the Emperor remained paralyzed by theological shock, Marcus noticed a subtle, highly coordinated movement near the heavily armored pillars flanking the throne. The captain of the Royal Guard was slowly, deliberately inching his hand toward a specialized crimson communication unit affixed to his heavy combat harness. Xylar was terrified, yes. But a terrifying emperor is still an emperor. Panic inevitably breeds extreme violence. Marcus smiled, a cold, calculating expression. The real negotiation was about to begin, and it was going to require far more than just pointing at a caged god. A deity in a box is an excellent icebreaker, but it makes for a phenomenally volatile negotiation table. Marcus adjusted his cuffs, entirely ignoring the heavily armed guards who were now twitching with a potent mix of religious terror and murderous intent. "Here is how this is going to work," Marcus announced, pulling a neatly folded sheet of standard Earth printer paper from his breast pocket. He smoothed it out with infuriating slowness. Article 1. The Valerix Armada currently blocking our sun will immediately power down all kinetic and energy weapons. You will break formation and retreat beyond the orbit of our furthest gas giant within 1 standard Earth hour. An older Valerix advisor, draped in heavy ceremonial robes of deep crimson, stepped forward. His voice trembled, though whether from age or absolute outrage was difficult to tell. You stand in the presence of the apex throne, holding a crude explosive to the throat of the divine, and you demand we retreat. This is not a negotiation, it is a hostage situation orchestrated by barbarians. Marcus offered a polite, apologetic nod. I understand your frustration. Hostage situation is a very harsh phrase. We prefer to call it aggressive collateral leverage. Now, Article 2. Earth will be granted unrestricted access to the hyperlanes traversing the Orion Arm. Furthermore, we require an immediate technology transfer regarding your atmospheric scrubbers, your localized agricultural synthesizers, and, frankly, whatever anti-gravity tech keeps your Emperor's throne hovering. Our chiropractors back home would pay a fortune for that. The absurdity of a fragile human demanding galactic trade concessions while standing in the crosshairs of 1,000 vaporizing lances was not lost on the court. The crimson-robed advisor sputtered, his facial scales flaring a bright, angry orange. You demand the tithe of 1,000 conquered worlds for a single polluted mud ball? We have ground empires to dust for less. Yes, but those empires did not bring your creator over in a terrifyingly unstable containment vessel. Marcus shot back, his tone conversational. We are entirely out of options, which makes us incredibly dangerous. You have everything to lose. We literally only have 1 planet left. If that cage breaches, it takes your capital, your fleet, and your entire religious foundation with it. So, I suggest we expedite the paperwork. Emperor Xylar had finally managed to silence the trembling in his massive hands. He slowly sat back down on the ruined apex throne, his 6 eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by the ruthless, predatory intellect that had allowed him to conquer a quadrant of the galaxy. You are very confident for a creature with such a short lifespan, Xylar rumbled, his voice regaining its synthesized, booming authority. You believe you hold all the cards, but your crude machine requires power. It requires stability. It is an abomination of physics, and it will fail. As Xylar spoke, Marcus noticed a subtle, rhythmic tapping of the Emperor's primary left claw against the armrest. It was not a nervous twitch. It was a localized, encrypted tactical cadence. Across the hall, the captain of the Royal Guard slightly adjusted his posture, his hand sliding away from the Crimson Communication Unit and resting casually on the hilt of a specialized, heavy-duty suppression blade. Xylar was stalling. He was keeping Marcus talking while his elite guard prepared a highly synchronized, violently fast surgical strike to sever the cage from its human operators. Marcus needed to buy time. He needed a distraction. I assure you, Your Radiance, the machine is perfectly stable. Well, mostly stable. The warning lights have been flashing red for 2 days. But our engineers assure me that is just a calibration error. It was at that exact moment the humming of the containment cage shifted. The violent, erratic vibration that had been rattling Marcus's teeth suddenly smoothed out into a low, resonant harmonic frequency. The sickly yellow light of the crude human tethers pulsed, and the fractal storm of pure white quantum energy inside the cage stopped thrashing. It settled into a distinct, hyper-dense sphere. Marcus felt a sudden sharp pressure behind his eyes, like the onset of a massive migraine, followed instantly by a voice in his head. It was not a sound. It was an injection of pure, translated thought, sterile and incredibly annoyed. Your primitive bindings are causing localized friction on my fourth-dimensional axis, the voice stated clearly in Marcus's mind. It is the cosmic equivalent of an itchy sweater. I highly recommend you adjust the polarity before I accidentally invert the strong nuclear force in this room. Marcus blinked, fighting the urge to rub his temples. He kept his face perfectly neutral, staring at the Emperor while carrying on a telepathic conversation with the supposed supreme creator of the universe. I cannot adjust the polarity, Marcus thought back, hoping the entity could hear his internal monologue. The dial is broken. Someone spilled coffee on the console during our escape. Typical, the entity replied, projecting a profound sense of exhaustion. For what it is worth, human, I am not their god. That revelation hit Marcus harder than the physical gravity of the throne room. He maintained his composed exterior, but his mind raced. What do you mean? Marcus asked internally. They built an interstellar empire in your name. They sing hymns to your light. They are remarkably unimaginative parasites, the entity retorted. I am a Class 9 stellar architect. I build nebulas, I seed planetary nurseries millions of your years ago. I was ambushed by a rival intellect. They trapped me in that broken sector of space, sealing me in a localized temporal anomaly. These Valerix creatures simply stumbled upon the ambient radiation of my prison a few millennia ago, misinterpreted a distress beacon as a divine commandment, and started conquering their neighbors. Their chanting is mathematically incorrect and deeply irritating. Marcus almost laughed out loud. The great and terrifying Valerix Empire, the scourge of the galaxy, was fundamentally based on a colossal misunderstanding. They were worshipping a trapped, frustrated cosmic construction worker. If you are not their god, Marcus thought, why not just break out and tell them? Because your crude cage is currently masking my energy signature, the architect replied. If I breach these bindings now, the intellects that originally trapped me will sense my awakening. They will return, and I assure you, human, they are vastly more terrible than the armored fools standing in this room. However, the one on the throne is about to order his guards to detach your machine's primary power coupling. He believes it will disable the explosive yield. It will actually just collapse the magnetic field and turn us all into exotic matter. Marcus shifted his gaze slightly, confirming the entity's warning. Two Valerix elite guards were silently sliding along the dark matter walls, flanking the human marines, their suppression blades drawn and vibrating with a lethal, silent hum. The standoff was about to turn into a bloodbath. Marcus knew he could not stop the guards before they struck the containment cage. The political game was over. The survival game had just begun. He needed an ally inside the court, someone who understood that the Emperor's arrogance was about to exterminate everyone in the room. He just had to find the one Valerix in the room smart enough to recognize a false idol when they saw one. The line between a historical massacre and a tactical miracle usually comes down to a single person deciding to break the rules. For Marcus Vance, that person materialized in the form of an alien academic wearing the emerald green robes of a Valerix high scholar. As the Emperor's elite guards began their silent, lethal glide along the perimeter of the Great Hall, a female Valerix stepped out from the trembling crowd of courtiers. She was shorter than the hulking military castes, sleek and angular, with shimmering scales the color of brushed silver. Without asking for permission, she strode directly toward the center of the room, raising a small, faceted crystalline device in her right hand. She crushed the crystal between her fingers. A distortion wave washed over Marcus. The heavy, oppressive ambient noise of the massive throne room simply ceased to exist. The murmurs of the terrified advisors, the grinding hum of the containment cage, and the heavy footfalls of the approaching guards vanished. It was an acoustic shadow, A highly localized bubble of absolute silence that rendered anyone inside it entirely deaf to the outside world, and the outside world entirely deaf to them. To Emperor Xylar, it looked as though his high scholar had stepped forward to formally inspect the human heresy. Inside the bubble, however, the silver-scaled Valerix turned to Marcus and spoke in flawless, unaccented English. "You have exactly 3 minutes before the Royal Execution Squad severs your spine and turns your Marines into a fine mist," she said, her tone brisk and entirely devoid of the religious panic plaguing the rest of her species. "I highly suggest you do not try to negotiate with an egomaniac." Marcus blinked, quickly adjusting to the sudden sensory shift. He looked at the scholar, noting the sharp, calculating intelligence in her deep blue eyes. "I appreciate the warning, but I have a highly volatile cosmic entity in a box. I figured that bought me at least an afternoon of diplomatic immunity." "It bought you an audience," she corrected, crossing her arms. "I am High Scholar Alara, and unlike the heavily armored zealots in this room, I have a doctorate in astrophysics. That is not a god in your crude, depleted uranium trap. It is a trapped Class 9 celestial constructor. You humans managed to leash a cosmic architect, which is a truly spectacular level of insane audacity." Marcus felt a genuine, unscripted smile pull at the corner of his mouth. In a room full of dogmatic, terrifying aliens, he had just found the one person who actually understood the joke. There was a sudden electric spark of mutual respect between them. The instant camaraderie of two profound cynics trapped in a room full of dangerous believers. "You don't buy the divine light routine?" Marcus asked, stepping slightly closer. She smelled faintly of ozone and old, dry parchment. Ilara scoffed, a purely universal gesture of academic disdain. "My species built an entire interstellar empire on a mathematical misunderstanding. We found a distress beacon and decided to worship it. It is embarrassing. I have spent my entire career trying to subtly steer our leadership away from holy wars and back toward rational science. But my emperor is an idiot." "My leaders are heavily armed idiots," Marcus replied, his voice softening slightly. "Which is arguably worse. They want to use this thing as a permanent battery to hold your empire hostage." Alara looked at him, her ice-blue eyes locking onto his. In another life, under completely different stars, Marcus could easily see himself buying this woman a drink and arguing about quantum mechanics until sunrise. She possessed a fierce, practical beauty, an intellect that cut through the bureaucratic nonsense of their respective worlds like a scalpel. They were two highly competent people standing at the center of a galactic powder keg, and they both knew the fuse was already lit. "Your leaders will not get the chance," Ilara said, her expression turning deadly serious. "The tapping, the Emperor's claw on his throne. It is an old imperial military cipher. He is not just ordering his guards to secure the entity. He is initiating a purge." Marcus frowned, glancing through the transparent shimmer of the acoustic bubble. Emperor Xylar was still seated, looking impatient but confident. The heavy blast doors at the far end of the hall were slowly sliding shut, sealing the room. "A purge?" Marcus asked. "Xylar's regime has been failing economically for decades," Ilara explained rapidly. "He needs a unifying event, a holy war. By bringing the so-called luminary here, you have handed him the ultimate political weapon. He is going to slaughter your delegation. Then he will slaughter the moderate advisors in this room. He will claim that humanity attempted to assassinate our God, and that he personally intervened to save it. Once he controls your containment cage, he will reverse engineer your gravity tethers and use the architect's energy to build a reality-warping weapon. He will not just destroy Earth. He will subjugate the entire Orion arm." The sheer scale of the betrayal was staggering. Marcus had walked in expecting a tense hostage negotiation, only to realize he was the opening act of a military coup. "Well," Marcus said, rolling his shoulders to relieve the tension building in his neck. "We certainly cannot let him do that. Do you have a plan?" "Scholar." Ilara reached into the deep pockets of her emerald robes and produced a sleek, obsidian data spike. "I am the chief architect of the Imperial Planetary Defense Grid. I have clearance to access the main hypercom array housed directly beneath this throne room. But I need a massive, unshielded power source to override the Emperor's lockdown protocols." Marcus felt the familiar sharp pressure behind his eyes as the celestial architect listening in on their conversation made its presence known again. "I can provide the surge." The sterile, translated thought echoed in Marcus's mind. "If you connect my localized energy field to their communication array, I can broadcast a directed quantum pulse. It will ride their own network directly to the armada orbiting your planet." "Hold on," Marcus said aloud, holding up a hand. Ilara gave him a questioning look. "I have the entity in my head," he explained quickly. "It says it can fry the fleet holding Earth hostage, but we have to plug the cage into your network." Ilara's eyes widened in sheer fascination. "You are actively communicating with a celestial constructor? The localized radiation alone should be cooking your frontal lobe." "I have a very high tolerance for headaches," Marcus said dryly. "If we do this, what happens to the fleet? I cannot authorize the vaporization of 1 billion Valoric sailors. My government wants peace, not genocide." "It will not kill them," Ilara assured him, her mind clearly racing as she began calculating the physics of the maneuver. "A quantum displacement pulse will fundamentally rewrite the software logic of every ship connected to the Imperial network. It will instantly brick their navigation drives, their weapons targeting systems, and their faster-than-light engines. The Armada will be reduced to a collection of very large, heavily armored floating bricks. They will be stranded in your solar system, completely unarmed, forcing a diplomatic surrender." It was a brilliant, elegant solution. It bypassed the bloodshed entirely and dismantled the Emperor's power at the source. But executing it required navigating a logistical nightmare. "To connect the cage to your data spike, my Marines have to drop the primary blast shielding on the containment platform," Marcus warned. "The second that shield drops, your acoustic bubble shatters, and the Emperor's guards will be on us in a heartbeat." "Then we will have to be remarkably fast," Ilara said, her silver scales shifting to a steely, resolute gray. She stepped closer to Marcus, slipping the obsidian data spike into his hand. Her fingers lingered against his for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement of the sheer insanity they were about to attempt. "You must force the connection at the base of the cage. I will override the palace network from the Grand Console behind the throne to create the conduit." Marcus gripped the spike. It felt cool and heavy in his palm. He looked at his 6 human Marines, still bracing the heavy chains of the containment cage. They were sweating, terrified, but holding their ground. They had flown into the darkest corner of the universe to save their home. And now they had to hold the line against an army of alien zealots. "When this is over," Marcus said, looking back at Ilara, "and assuming we are not both reduced to exotic matter, I am taking you to Earth. We have this beverage called coffee. I think you would find it highly efficient." Ilara offered a brief razor-sharp smile. "I will hold you to that. Envoy Vance, prepare your men." The acoustic bubble was beginning to destabilize, the edges fraying into static. Outside the barrier, the elite guards had reached their final flanking positions. Emperor Xylar raised his massive clawed hand, preparing to drop it, the universal signal to initiate the slaughter. Marcus turned his back to the High Scholar, slipping the data spike into his suit pocket. He caught the eye of his lead Marine and gave a sharp, definitive nod. The time for talking was over. The universe was about to witness what happens when a human and an alien decide to hijack a god. A loaded weapon is only as dangerous as the person holding it, but a caged god is dangerous simply because it exists. The acoustic bubble engineered by high scholar Alara began to dissolve, its edges fracturing into static and bleeding the oppressive heavy noise of the great hall back into Marcus's ears. Emperor Xylar's massive clawed hand was suspended in the air, right at the apex of its arc. When that hand fell, the Royal Execution Squad would close the distance in a matter of seconds. Marcus had his hand wrapped tightly around the obsidian data spike in his pocket. The plan was set. He just had to slam the spike into the cage's primary conduit. Let Alara route the palace network and allow the captive entity to lobotomize the alien armada orbiting Earth. It was a brilliantly pragmatic strategy. It would save billions of human lives. It was also an act of profound, unforgivable hypocrisy. Before Marcus could withdraw his hand from his pocket, the sickly yellow light of the gravity tethers pulsed with blinding intensity. The physical world around Marcus simply stopped. It was not a metaphor. The air turned to a substance resembling thick, invisible syrup. The chaotic din of the throne room stretched into a low, unrecognizable drone, then vanished entirely. Emperor Xylar's hand froze midway through its lethal descent. A Valeric's elite guard, caught mid-stride with his suppression blade raised, hung suspended like a grotesque statue, his foot hovering an inch above the dark matter floor. Even the bead of sweat rolling down the cheek of Marcus's lead marine was locked perfectly in place. Marcus found he could still breathe, and he could still think, but his physical body was anchored to the floor by an immense, unseen pressure. I have compressed the localized temporal flow. The sterile, translated thought of the architect echoed in his mind. The voice was louder now, carrying the weight of collapsing stars and the cold, vast emptiness of deep space. It requires a significant expenditure of my remaining unshielded energy. We have precisely 40 of your seconds to conclude our business before normal physics reasserts itself. You could have stopped time this whole trip, Marcus thought back, his mind racing to comprehend the sheer scale of the being trapped in the uranium box. I cannot sustain it, the architect replied, a tone of deep fatigue lacing the telepathic projection. And I did it now because you are about to make a monumental error. Envoy Vance. The scholar's plan is mathematically sound, but morally bankrupt. If you force my energy through the data spike while I remain bound by your micro-singularities, the resulting feedback loop will permanently fuse my consciousness to your crude machine. I will become a permanent, agonizingly static battery. I will lobotomize their fleet, yes, but I will die in the process. Slowly, over millennia. Marcus felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He felt the encrypted data pad resting in his inner breast pocket, right next to the data spike. It contained his ultimate classified orders from the subterranean bunker back on Earth. The Black Site generals and surviving politicians had been very clear. They did not just want peace, they wanted the leash. Their orders dictated that once the Valeric's armada was neutralized, Marcus was to maintain the containment field indefinitely. Earth would use the threat of the caged entity to demand tribute, technology, and absolute submission from the rest of the galaxy. Humanity, the scrappy, desperate underdog fighting for survival, was fully intending to step into the power vacuum and become the exact same tyrant they were currently fighting. They were going to build their own empire on the back of a tortured, enslaved cosmic builder. You see the shape of your own chains now, the architect observed quietly in his mind. Your species is terrified. Fear is the greatest catalyst for cruelty. You have brought me here to dethrone a false god, only to realize your own leaders wish to become the new false gods. The moral weight of the situation crushed down on Marcus heavier than the artificial gravity of the palace. He was an envoy, a soldier of diplomacy. His entire career was built on following orders for the greater good of his nation. And now, his planet. But what was the value of saving humanity if they lost their collective soul in the process? To force an ancient sentient being into perpetual agony just to secure a political advantage was the very definition of the evil they claimed to be fighting. What is the alternative? Marcus demanded internally. Trust, the architect stated simply. A concept your species struggles with immensely. Do not use the data spike. Do not route my energy through a filter of depleted uranium and human paranoia. Shatter the tethers entirely. Break the containment field. Give me my infinite geometry back. If I let you out, you could vaporize this entire solar system out of spite, Marcus argued. You could wipe out Earth for putting you in that box. I have 8 billion lives riding on this. I cannot just open the door and hope you are feeling generous. I am a builder, human, not a destroyer, the architect replied, the psychic projection radiating a profound, unshakable calm. The Valorix misread my distress signal as wrath. Do not make the same primitive mistake. If you free me, I will dismantle this armada without a single loss of life. I will dismantle this empire's ability to wage war, but I will do it on my terms. And then, I will leave this galaxy. You must choose between remaining a warden or becoming a free man. The temporal compression was failing. Marcus could see the sickly yellow light of the tethers beginning to flicker rapidly. The suspended foot of the Valorix guard dropped a fraction of a millimeter. The low drone of the room started to pitch upward, returning to the sound of a terrified, angry mob. Marcus looked at the frozen face of Emperor Xylar. He saw the pure, unadulterated arrogance of a being who believed he owned the universe. Then, Marcus thought of the generals hiding in the dirt back on Earth, drafting plans to rule the stars with an iron fist. They were two sides of the exact same coin. A cage is a cage, whether it is forged from alien dogma or human survivalism. If humanity wanted to be free, they had to act like a free species. And a free species does not build its home on the back of a slave. Marcus made a decision that would undoubtedly result in his court-martial, assuming he survived the next 5 minutes. He was going rogue. He was going to throw away the leverage, ignore his direct orders, and bet the entire future of the human race on the word of a trapped star maker. Okay, Marcus thought, projecting absolute certainty. We do it your way. Brace yourself, Envoy, the architect replied. Physics is about to get very loud. The invisible syrup shattered. Normal time snapped back into existence with the force of a physical blow. The cacophony of the great hall rushed into Marcus's ears. Emperor Xylar's hand completed its downward arc, slamming against the armrest of the apex throne. The elite guards surged forward, their boots thundering against the polished floor, their suppression blades humming with lethal intent. High Scholar Alara was already sprinting toward the Grand Console behind the throne, her emerald robes flaring behind her, fully expecting Marcus to enact their agreed-upon plan. Marcus spun on his heel, completely ignoring the approaching wall of heavily armored alien executioners. He locked eyes with his lead Marine, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Miller, who was gripping the heavy chains of the containment platform. Change of plans, Sergeant, Marcus roared over the deafening noise of the charging guards. He pulled the obsidian data spike from his pocket and casually tossed it onto the floor, letting it shatter against the dark matter tiles. Miller's eyes went wide with shock. Sir, what about the override? We aren't overriding anything, Marcus shouted, drawing a sleek, high-impact kinetic sidearm from his shoulder holster. He pointed it directly at the pulsing, sickly yellow micro-singularity generators bolted to the side of the uranium cage. "We are blowing the core. Drop the chains and manually disengage the dampeners. We are letting it out." Miller hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was an order that defied all logic, all tactical training, and the direct commands of Earth's highest authorities. It was a suicide order. But Miller looked at Marcus, saw the absolute unbreakable resolve in the Envoy's eyes, and made his own choice. "Disengage dampeners," Miller barked to the rest of the squad. "Blow the locks." "Do it now." The Marines slammed their fists onto the emergency release latches. The heavy iron-gray bands binding the fractal storm of light began to groan, sparking violently as the localized gravity fields realized they were being forcefully shut down. Across the room, Ilara reached the console, her fingers flying over the crystalline interface. She glanced back, expecting to see Marcus connecting the power conduit. Instead, she saw the human Envoy aiming a kinetic pistol at the most volatile piece of machinery in the known universe, right as the Emperor's royal guard descended upon them. Violence in an alien throne room does not start with a battle cry. It starts with the sudden, terrifying absence of protocol. The moment Emperor Xylar's hand struck the armrest, the opulent Great Hall transformed from a diplomatic sanctuary into a slaughterhouse. The elite Valerix guards did not run. They glided across the dark matter floor with predatory, synchronized efficiency. Their heavy armor was completely silent, and their suppression blades vibrated at a frequency that physically blurred the air around the metal. They moved as a unified wall of bioengineered muscle and localized energy shielding, designed to overwhelm and execute any threat within seconds. They expected the humans to cower, to beg, or to die frozen in terror. Humans, however, are deeply accustomed to fighting from a severe disadvantage. Sergeant Miller did not flinch at the approaching wall of alien death. He dropped the heavy chain of the containment cage and kicked a thick metal latch on the side of his thigh armor. A fist-sized, matte black canister deployed onto the polished floor. It was a rapid expansion kinetic barrier. The device detonated not with fire, but with a violent concussive shockwave, instantly erecting a shimmering wall of hyper-dense, hexagonal hard light directly in front of the human Envoy. The lead Valerix guard slammed into the barrier at full speed. The kinetic impact was phenomenal. The hexagonal shield flared a bright, angry crimson, absorbing the alien's massive momentum and violently redirecting it back outward. The guard was thrown backward, his massive frame tumbling across the floor like a discarded ragdoll, shattering the pristine dark matter tiles. The remaining guards adjusted immediately. They raised their stasis lances, the tips flaring with blinding blue light. Beams of atom-separating energy lashed out, striking the hard light barrier. The air instantly filled with the sharp, acidic smell of scorched ozone and melting copper as the human technology strained against the alien weaponry. Behind the apex throne, High Scholar Ilara watched Marcus toss the obsidian data spike away. She realized instantly that the human Envoy had completely abandoned their surgical, non-lethal network override. He was not trying to hack the fleet. He was going to detonate the literal God bomb right in the middle of the palace. Instead of freezing in panic, Ilara adapted with terrifying speed. She slammed her hands onto the massive crystalline console dominating the dais. Her fingers danced across the faceted interface, bypassing the Emperor's personal security protocols with the sheer, desperate genius of someone who had designed the system herself. If Marcus needed time to manually break the physical locks on the cage, she would give it to him by weaponizing the room itself. She isolated the artificial gravity grid directly beneath a squad of charging royal guards on the left flank. She did not turn the gravity off. She violently inverted it in a highly localized radius. 6 hulking Valerix warriors, mid-stride and preparing to flank the human Marines, suddenly found themselves falling aggressively upward. They smashed into the simulated nebula on the ceiling with bone-crunching force, their heavy armor pinning them against the atmospheric dome as they thrashed in confusion. Marcus ignored the absolute chaos erupting around him. He stepped right up to the pulsing, groaning containment cage. The sickly yellow light of the gravity tethers was blinding up close, casting long, erratic shadows across his face. The micro-singularity generators bolted to the depleted uranium frame were shielded by thick layers of reinforced steel. He needed to break the physical connection before the dampeners failed completely and triggered a catastrophic implosion that would turn the entire hemisphere of the planet into an exotic matter crater. The remaining Marines formed a tight, heavily disciplined half-circle around Marcus. They unholstered their own kinetic sidearms. These were ugly, blocky, utilitarian weapons that fired compressed tungsten slugs at hypersonic speeds. Standard Valerix energy shields were elegantly designed to deflect plasma, lasers, and localized radiation. They were absolutely not designed to stop raw, unadulterated mass moving at Mach 5. "Fire at will!" Miller roared, bracing his boots against the floor. The Marines fired in controlled, deafening bursts. The concussive roar of the kinetic weapons shattered the elegant acoustic design of the Great Hall. The tungsten slugs hit the localized energy shields of the Valerix guards like sledgehammers against glass. The elegant, shimmering barriers shattered instantly, and the hyper-dense rounds punched cleanly through their chromatic scales, dropping the towering elite warriors to the floor in heaps of ruined armor. It was brutal, incredibly loud, and entirely undignified. The alien guards, trained for elegant high-tech dueling, were being torn apart by the spatial equivalent of throwing very fast rocks. Emperor Xylar roared from his ruined throne, a sound of pure, unhinged fury that shook the walls. He realized his elite guard was being decimated by a handful of primates. He reached under his seat and drew his own personal weapon, a heavy, ornate plasma caster capable of vaporizing a light transport vehicle. He aimed the massive barrel directly at Marcus's exposed back. Before Xylar could pull the trigger, Ilara rerouted the liquid light rivers flowing through the floor of the dais. A geyser of searing, sterile energy erupted directly in front of the throne, acting as a blinding, superheated curtain. The Emperor fired blindly, the massive plasma bolt scorching the ceiling and sending molten debris raining down onto the empty courtier stands. "The blast doors are locked," Ilara shouted over the din of battle, her hands still flying across the console. "No reinforcements can get in. But Xylar is trying to vent the atmosphere in the room. I can only block his override commands for another 90 seconds. 90 seconds is plenty of time," Marcus shouted back, though his voice was nearly lost in the roar of gunfire and crashing alien bodies. He raised his kinetic pistol, aiming at the side of the uranium cage. The localized gravity of the failing machine was immense. It was actively pulling at his clothes, his arm, and the very blood in his veins. Standing this close to the collapsing micro-singularities felt like leaning into the teeth of a hurricane. The entity inside was thrashing violently, its radiant multi-dimensional geometry pushing aggressively against the weakening tethers. Marcus aimed at the primary locking pin of the central generator. It was a shot that required absolute, unwavering precision while standing in the epicenter of a desperate firefight. He had to hit a target the size of a coin while fighting the gravitational pull of a dying star. Sergeant Miller stepped into Marcus's peripheral vision, taking a glancing blow from a suppression blade that sheared straight through his shoulder armor. Miller did not fall. He planted his boots, leveled his sidearm, and unloaded 3 tungsten rounds point-blank into the attacking guard's chest, sending the alien crashing backward into the pulsing hard light barrier. "Any day now, Envoy," Miller grunted, blood seeping through the scarred plating of his suit. Marcus took a sharp breath, filtering out the noise, the violence, and the terrifying weight of the alien empire crashing down around him. He focused entirely on the heavy iron-gray band wrapping the center of the radiant entity. He squeezed the trigger. The concussive blast of the pistol kicked hard against his palm. The hypersonic tungsten slug struck the locking pin dead center. The reinforced steel shattered outward in a spray of jagged shrapnel. Immediately, the primary micro-singularity generator whined, a sound so high-pitched it made Marcus's teeth ache. The sickly yellow light flickered, turned a violent shade of crimson, and died. The thick, brutalist iron-gray band snapped open. The sudden release of pressure was catastrophic. A shockwave of pure, unadulterated quantum energy exploded outward from the cage, instantly vaporizing the hard light barrier and throwing the human Marines violently across the room. The remaining Valerix guards were swept off their feet, their heavy armor skidding across the dark matter floor as if they weighed nothing at all. Marcus was thrown backward, sliding painfully across the polished tiles until he slammed into the base of a towering pillar. He gasped for air, his vision swimming with afterimages of searing white light. The great hall fell dead silent. The gunfire ceased. The humming of the suppression blades vanished. Even Emperor Xylar lowered his heavy plasma caster, his 6 eyes wide with absolute paralyzing dread. The depleted uranium cage had been completely blown apart. The heavy plates hovered in the air for a fraction of a second before clattering heavily to the ground. In the center of the room, free from its localized gravity tethers, the luminary expanded. It did not just grow in size, it unfolded into dimensions the physical space of the room could barely contain. The fractal storm of pure white light towered over the apex throne, radiating an aura of immense, crushing power that instantly bypassed the optical nerves and burned directly into the minds of everyone present. Marcus pushed himself up on one elbow, his ribs aching, his kinetic pistol lying uselessly a few feet away. He looked up at the towering, unbound geometry of the celestial architect. The entity had promised to dismantle the armada and spare their lives. But as the searing light filled the entirety of the great hall, warping the dark matter walls and dissolving the simulated nebula on the ceiling, Marcus realized the terrifying truth of his gamble. You can negotiate with an empire. You can fight an army. But when you break the chains off a being that builds stars for a living, you no longer have any say in what happens next. True cosmic power does not scream when it is unleashed. It simply rewrites the rules of reality without asking for permission. Marcus Vance lay bruised on the polished dark matter floor, watching the universe aggressively adjust to the presence of an unbound star maker. The entity known as the Luminary did not possess a physical face. Yet the room was suddenly filled with an expression of profound, ancient relief. The fractal storm of pure white quantum energy expanded, pushing right through the physical walls of the great hall as if the impenetrable dark matter fortress were made of wet tissue paper. The oppressive, heavy gravity of the palace was entirely neutralized, replaced by a floating, weightless sensation that smelled sharply of ozone and blooming flowers. Emperor Xylar dropped his heavy plasma caster. The weapon clattered uselessly to the floor. The towering ruler, the architect of 1,000 planetary subjugations, fell violently to his knees. His shimmering scales were entirely drained of color, leaving him a hollow, ashen gray. He threw his massive arms wide, pressing his forehead against the shattered floor tiles, and began to forcefully recite the ancient rhythmic hymns of his people's absolute faith. He was begging his God for a miracle. He was begging his God for the strength to slaughter the humans who had defiled the throne room. The response he received was not a blessing, but a telepathic broadcast that struck every single mind on the planet simultaneously. Silence, parasite. The architect commanded. The voice did not echo in the air. It vibrated in the marrow of their bones, carrying the immense crushing weight of a collapsing nebula. I have witnessed the empire you built in the shadow of my localized radiation. You took the spark of creation and used it to forge chains. You are a profound disappointment, Xylar gasped, clutching his chest as if the words had physically pierced his armor. The elite Valerix guards, those who had survived the frantic kinetic firefight, immediately dropped their suppression blades. They fell to their knees alongside their emperor, completely paralyzed by the realization that their divine mandate was fundamentally, historically wrong. High Scholar Ilara stood at the Grand Console behind the ruined Apex throne, her hands resting flat against the crystalline interface. She watched the massive atmospheric dome above them warp and turn entirely transparent, offering a crystal-clear view of the planetary orbit. High above the atmosphere, the suffocating steel ring of the Valerix armada hung ominously in the void. 1,000 dreadnoughts, bristling with world-ending weaponry, were holding position, ready to turn Earth into a cinder at a moment's notice. The architect did not lash out with fire. It did not summon a storm of plasma or tear the ships apart with localized black holes. Instead, the entity simply shifted its multi-dimensional geometry, sending a silent, rippling wave of quantum displacement directly upward. Marcus watched through the transparent ceiling as the wave hit the fleet. It looked like a heat shimmer passing over a mirage. Instantly, the glowing blue thruster arrays of the dreadnoughts flickered and died. The brutal, jagged energy shields completely evaporated. The colossal weapons batteries, charged and humming with lethal intent just seconds prior, powered down into absolute darkness. The architect did not kill the millions of sailors aboard those vessels. It simply rewrote the fundamental software logic of their hyperdrives, their targeting computers, and their navigation arrays. In a fraction of a second, the most terrifying military force in the known galaxy was reduced to a collection of incredibly large, highly decorated floating paperweights. They were utterly stranded, their teeth pulled, their engines cold. "The planetary grid is clear," Ilara announced, her voice ringing out in the hushed throne room. She looked at Marcus, a fierce, triumphant smile breaking across her face. "The armada is completely bricked. They have life support and internal comms, but they cannot move a single inch. They are entirely disarmed." The architect's radiant form began to condense, pulling inward from the edges of the room. The blinding light softened into a warm, golden hue. "My debt is paid, Envoy Vance." The translated thought echoed gently in Marcus's mind. "Your species is terrifyingly pragmatic, but you chose the terrifying burden of freedom over the comfortable certainty of control. Do not lose that trait. The universe has enough wardens. It needs more builders." Marcus pushed himself up from the floor, leaning heavily against the nearest pillar. He wiped a smear of blood from his jaw, looking directly at the golden core of the entity. "Where will you go?" "Outward," the architect replied. "There are dead sectors at the edge of this galaxy that require seeding. There is work to be done. Try not to destroy yourselves before we meet again." With a sudden, silent implosion of light, the architect folded space. The fractal geometry collapsed into a single, blinding pinpoint, and then vanished entirely. The normal, heavy artificial gravity of the Great Hall slammed back into place. The rivers of liquid light in the floor slowly flickered back to life. The room was a disaster zone of shattered tiles, ruined armor, and the smoldering remains of a depleted uranium cage. But the air was clear. The suffocating dread was gone. Marcus holstered his kinetic sidearm and walked slowly toward the center of the dais. Sergeant Miller and the surviving human Marines rallied behind him, their armor cracked and bleeding, but their weapons lowered. They had won. They had defied their own ruthless leadership, broken the chains of a cosmic prisoner, and somehow saved their homeworld in the process. Emperor Xylar remained on his knees, his 6 eyes staring blankly at the empty space where the luminary had just been. His empire was broken. His fleet was paralyzed. His god had publicly disowned him. He was a tyrant without a sword, surrounded by guards who now knew his entire reign was a theological lie. Ilara gracefully stepped down from the grand console, her emerald robes pristine amidst the wreckage. She stopped in front of the broken emperor, looking down at him with an expression of pure academic disdain. "Guards," Ilara said, her voice carrying the crisp, absolute authority of a new era. "Escort the former emperor to the holding cells in the lower sub-levels. He has a lot of historical texts to rewrite." For a moment, the heavily armored elite warriors hesitated. Then, looking from the empty space of their departed creator to the resolute face of the high scholar, they moved. 2 massive guards hauled Xylar to his feet, stripping him of his ceremonial sash and dragging him silently out of the great hall. Ilara turned to Marcus. The adrenaline of the firefight was fading, replaced by the profound, exhausting reality of planetary diplomacy. "I suppose this means Earth is no longer offering an unconditional surrender." Ilara noted, her silver scales shimmering in the returning light of the palace. "We are willing to negotiate," Marcus replied, offering a tired but genuine smile. "We will send tugboats to tow your stranded fleet back to your shipyards. We will share our agricultural synthesizers. And in return, you leave our solar system alone, and we open up a genuine, equitable trade route. No gods, no cages, just highly flawed species trying to figure out the neighborhood." Ilara stepped closer, her deep blue eyes locking onto his. "And the coffee. Was that a formal diplomatic concession, or a personal invitation?" "Envoy Vance." "Strictly personal, scholar," Marcus said, adjusting his ruined suit jacket. "I know a little place in Vienna. The barista is incredibly rude, but the espresso will rewrite your DNA. I think you'll love it. The universe is a vast, hostile, and deeply absurd place. It is filled with dead sectors, tyrannical empires, and beings of unfathomable power. But history is rarely shaped by the gods. It is shaped by the stubborn, the desperate, and the entirely pragmatic individuals who refuse to kneel." Humanity had flown into the abyss looking for a weapon, and they had returned with something far more dangerous. They had returned with their integrity intact. They had learned the ultimate lesson of the cosmos. Power is not defined by how many chains you hold. True power is having the courage to break the locks, look the unknown in the eye, and walk forward entirely unbound. Thank you so much for watching this story unfold. If you enjoyed this journey into the heart of the Valerix Empire, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans. I want to hear from you in the comments. So drop the word architect down below to let me know you made it to the very end of the Envoy's mission. And please, hit that hype button so the algorithm knows to push this story to more viewers just like you.